So in this video we asked the question, could virtual landscape photography actually be a thing? Now obviously software like that doesn't exist at the moment, but I can demonstrate what I mean by jumping into a computer game. But just try and get your head around this for a second. Can you imagine walking freely around a landscape like we do in real life, looking for compositions, looking for striking panoramas, shots to take? Can you imagine if we can actually then take the image, if we can print the images, or better still, share them on social media, and better still print, whichever way you look at it. I mean, realistically, get your head around that for a quick second. The possibilities are endless. But could it really be a thing? Before we jump in, just a quick disclaimer. I'm going to show you what I mean and what I'm trying to demonstrate, and the reasons why I'm trying to demonstrate this using a computer game. The computer game is called Battlefield 4. It's a game I've seen my son play quite a few times, so I've got a feel for how it works. And you'll see me wander around the landscapes looking for compositions and images to take, which is obviously what this video is all about. But just so you know, the game that I'm about to show you, the software was released in 2013. It was probably in development for about 3 or 4 years prior to that. So realistically, you're looking at software that's about 8 or 9 years old. So if you're wondering why it's a little bit jittery or whatever, but the idea is just to get your head around it. But software and software developers have come on leaps and bounds since then. Watch the video, then at the end of the video, I'll summarize what I feel about this software. But don't switch off just yet. Just hear me out. So the first question raised must surely be why? Well, let's just think about this positively for a second. I mean, teachers could benefit greatly. What about teachers explaining about composition, rules of thirds and lighting, etc.? Can you imagine teachers working in a classroom environment? Parents getting their kids enthused by the endless possibilities landscape photography offers? What about people who are housebound? What about people with medical issues or disabilities? What about the old? What about the young? What about the lazy? Surely it's great to know that we can all learn a new skill in a comfortable, safe and warm environment, isn't it? Teachers, parents, kids, students, artists and designers, for instance. I mean, the list is endless. Is there a difference between a virtual reality world, a virtual landscape, and a real landscape? I mean, let's just think about this for a second. Currently, we take images that aren't a true representation of what we see, and yet we accept that to be the norm. Or do we? I mean, the human eye sees in 3 dimensions. Your camera captures a scene in 2D. But cleverly, the human then decodes the 2D image back into a 3-dimensional picture. So in essence, could we therefore assume our cameras are presently creating virtual pictures? Okay, so at the moment, as you can see when I'm wandering around, all I can do is take a screenshot. Although, if you look here, this software actually allows me, I didn't realize this until I looked into the menus a bit more, but this software actually allows me to stop and take a picture. I mean, how awesome is that? Now, it's only a low-res image. It's pretty much like a screenshot. But imagine if virtual photography landscape became a thing. If taking 2 or 3-dimensional pictures could be captured in RAW. I mean, can you imagine then if the RAW file could be manipulated further with your RAW editor, Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever? But this asks yet another question. Post-production, is it necessary? Would it be necessary? Could this software actually be the death of Photoshop for landscape photographers? I'll just think about this for a second. So you found a fantastic composition, but then you think, you know, I like the picture, but it could look so much better. I mean, it's a digital world after all. Imagine if you could virtually set up your camera on a virtual tripod and then let your creativity run riot. It's not too dissimilar from what we do now, is it? I mean, let's just think about this for a second. When we take pictures, we could take a picture in the virtual world and then just decide at a click of a button whether we prefer this picture taken during the day or taken at night. We all know that light has a drastic effect on the feel of a scene, so imagine if you could see it exactly how you want it. Changing weather conditions. We could add weather conditions, we could remove weather conditions at a click of a button. We could add clouds. Can you imagine if you wanted this particular scene that you're currently looking at with a bright blue and fluffy white clouds, like I call them Simpson skies, or maybe we prefer dramatic stormy clouds. What about godlike rays of light? What about the sun? What about the moon? What about neither? What about some effects? Let's add some lightning. HDR dead? I don't know. Maybe we could convert the image into a HDR image. Is another good one for you. What about the thing that seems to be very popular, especially on Instagram at the moment, is selfies. I mean, you could go into the garden, take a picture of yourself, then you could introduce yourself into the digital world as a silhouette stood on top of a mountain. I mean, let's be honest, we're not getting killed doing that, are we? And you still get all those pictures that seem to be so popular on Instagram. Okay, so this is another valid question. What about your camera settings? I mean, it's a virtual landscape world after all. Why should we even bother? Well, if you imagine this landscape world that we're talking about is designed around teaching photography, then surely you could actually have the exposure triangle, your aperture, shutter speed and ISO settings on the screen, so you could adjust them accordingly. I mean, it's a prerequisite, I imagine, of this software being created. Aperture controls your depth of field. How much of an image is in focus, how much of an image is out of focus. Games at the moment they're not all taken at f/22. It's not all a great depth of field. Even game manufacturers now make the games as realistic and as close to the human, or what the human eye sees, as it possibly can. But imagine if you set yourself up with a composition and then decided you wanted a shallow depth of field, then surely you would just change to f4, f2.8, f1.4, whatever. You could simply adjust those settings, and then you could, if you focus close to the camera, you could blur out the background and vice versa. Again, that's, I imagine, would be a prerequisite of this software. But all in all, it's teaching us about our camera settings. What about our shutter speed? Because shutter speeds, it's not relevant, is it, in the digital world? But of course, as a prerequisite of this software, this landscape photography software that's going to be created for our virtual world, then yes, we could see how an image will look using a fast shutter speed or a slow shutter speed. We can shoot waves crashing, we can shoot it at 1,000th of a second, then everything will be frozen, and then we could take the same shot, shoot it over a 4-minute exposure, and of course the sea will end up looking like an ice skating rink. Okay, so part of the exposure triangle is your ISO. Well, it's goodbye to the ISO, or is it? Hang on a minute. Why are we saying goodbye to the ISO? This software is all about teaching you photography, and ISO is an equal part of the exposure triangle. Can you imagine then, if you took a picture of a landscape and captured the scene, and maybe the light was dark, but you captured the scene at ISO 3200, so ISO 3200. Now, with a drop-down menu, I can see what my image will look like captured relative to, let's say, for instance, my Canon 5D Mark IV. Well, at a click of a button, I wonder what the same image looks like captured on a Nikon D850 or maybe a Sony A7, or what about a budget camera? I mean, it's all only software. It's only a camera profile that you can download. Photoshop currently does that now. If you look at your lens profile corrector, then if you go in there and click that button, then the Adobe software will detect which camera lens and which camera body you used, and any ailments that Adobe believes your camera lens has, it will then fix. So that's already going on. That's already a thing. So up to press, we've only talked about the technical issues, but what about the fantasy part? What about the immersion? What about the ability to wander around our virtual world from the comfort of our armchair? Spending hours and hours walking up and down Dale in search of that elusive landscape picture. I mean, that's what we do anyway, isn't it? Maybe in the very near future, you'll actually be able to download a real three-dimensional world. Yeah. Just think about this for a second. Can you imagine if you could download the whole photorealistic map pack of the Isle of Skye or Iceland or the Faroe Islands? Maybe we can't afford to go there. Maybe we don't have the time to go there. Maybe we don't have the ability to go there. So can you imagine, even from that aspect, if you could download that software and wander around our virtual world? Better still, can you imagine if you could download a map pack, for instance, of something like Mount Everest? Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 second that it's going to be as good as climbing Mount Everest. I'm not suggesting that for a second. I'm talking about the perspective of the photographer. So if you imagine that you could walk up Mount Everest, either stopping en route or just getting right to the summit. So now imagine you are on top of the world. You will never, ever in your lifetime, ever see what it looks like from the perspective of those climbers. Unless we watch some kind of documentary on TV, of course. But can you imagine now, you're up there in your virtual world that looks identical to the real world, except it's digital, and you look out, you look for compositions, and you see what it looks like on top of the world, and you then take pictures. How awesome would that be? How awesome would that be? In my opinion, I believe this software is inevitable. It might even be in production now, I don't really know. It's definitely going to happen. And I'm sure you have to agree that there's a massive, massive market for it. A massive market for it. Is it a substitute for the real thing? Well, of course it's not. Absolutely not, and never will be. I mean, there is no substitute for readying your equipment. Researching locations, checking tides and shooting conditions. It's just what we all do. And getting out there is the most important part of landscape photography. But if you agree with what I just said, that's possibly only because you can. But what about if you couldn't? Millions and millions of gamers every day run around a virtual world. It's nothing new. Ask them about what virtual reality means. I bet they get so immersed in their world, they very quickly forget they become momentarily detached from reality. Just think of how popular this could be. I haven't even thought through the possibilities of using this software for architecture or even drone photography. Obviously, most of the film footage that you've seen in my video replicates drone photography. And even though this software is old software, I'm sure you agree, it still looks outstanding. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether you believe there's a market for this software or not. Or maybe it's a step too far.